in 1177, Maimonides becomes the leader of the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Cairo. And so he's now in both a political and a teacher role. He's writing books, and he's the chief rabbi of the community. He also, at around this time, we know that because the family fortune was lost in this shipwreck, he had to go back to work. He had to get a real job. And Maimonides had been trained as a physician. So in addition to all the other things he did, he also had a little medical training. So he was a physician and was ultimately appointed the physician to the Sultan's court. So imagine this guy. He's a lawyer. He's writing books of law. He's a doctor who is ministering to the Sultan's court in Cairo. He's also the chief rabbi of the Jews of Cairo and is acting as a judge, because that's what rabbis did in that time, acting as a judge for the community. In that context, he begins to write a book that's one of the best known books of his. It's called the Minute Torah. This is not the Mishnah and not the Torah. It's the Minute Torah. The Minute Torah means in Hebrew the second telling of the Torah, the retelling of the Torah. This is Maimonides' book of Jewish law. Some of us have looked at parts of the Minute Torah before. It's his book where he essentially strives to make Jewish law accessible for regular Jews. Because any of us who gather on Thursday mornings to study the Talmud know that the Talmud is one of the worst places to learn Jewish law, because the Talmud is voluminous and it's not entirely focused on law. If I want to know the answer to a simple question like, how many candles am I supposed to light on Friday night? Or what are the words of the Kiddush? There could be 75 pages on that in the Talmud, and I still might not have an answer by the time I get to the end of it. So Maimonides takes it upon himself to whittle down the Talmud to the answers to the questions. And he writes this book called the Minute Torah, which essentially gives the way he believes a Jew is supposed to live. This is a practical book of Jewish living, except in the ways that it's also a philosophical book, because he gets into how a Jew is supposed to believe as well. But largely, it's a practical book of Jewish living. His son, his only son that survived, whose name is Avraham, was born in 1186. Maimonides is about 50 years old by then. And in that same year, he completed, or possibly a few years later, he completed his philosophical masterpiece. So remember, he had just gotten done writing the Minute Torah, which was his book of Jewish law, which was written in Hebrew. In fact, it was written in simple Hebrew for anyone to be able to read. The idea was any Jew should be able to read this book and find out the answers to how you're supposed to live. It was in many ways universally acclaimed. Universally is not the right word. It was widely acclaimed, but it was also widely criticized. There were other Jewish authorities out there who said that it was a bad idea to make Jewish law accessible for all these people, because the people will start thinking they don't need rabbis anymore. They're just going to read your book and do it and then follow it. We want them to come to us, say many of the other rabbis. So it took a few hundred years for Maimonides' Minute Torah to really be accepted, but it is today considered one of the authoritative books of Jewish law. His Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide for the Perplexed, which is the book we're going to be reading, is very different from that. It's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Arabic. Maimonides spoke several languages, one of them was Arabic. And it's not about what Jews do, it's rather about what Maimonides considers to be the foundations of Judaism, the foundations of Jewish beliefs. So just before we move on to the actual Guide of the Perplexed, to give you a sense of the incredible prolificness of this great Jewish thinker, we've already named 5 books he wrote: the Commentary on the Mishnah, the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of the Commandments, something called the Epistle to Yemen, which we didn't talk about, but which was a kind of a political writing to Jews in Yemen to give them hope and to teach them about Judaism, the Mishnah Torah, and the Guide of the Perplexed. Maimonides also wrote a whole series of other legal treatises, and he wrote medical treatises, because remember, he was the chief doctor to the Sultan. And so he wrote books that had names like the Treatise on Asthma, the Treatise on Poison, and my favorite, the Treatise on Hemorrhoids. So this is the same guy who's writing philosophy, writing law, and writing medical treatises, and is considered really an authority in all of those areas. There's a podcast I like to listen to that I've been listening to learn about philosophy recently. It's called Philosophize This. The host of Philosophize This says that Maimonides he's a doctor and a lawyer. He's everything you want to bring home to your mother, essentially. So that's really Maimonides in a nutshell. That's the person that we're talking about here, and those are the writings that we're talking about here. So what is the Guide of the Perplexed? The Guide of the Perplexed is Maimonides' major philosophical work. As I said, it was written in Arabic. It was written to be read in many ways not only by Jews, but also by people who were reading and writing Arabic philosophical work, of which there were many people during that time, and largely the philosophers of the Muslim world. So Maimonides believes, one thing I didn't mention back at the beginning is that from an early age, Maimonides was intrigued by philosophy, particularly by Western philosophy, by the writings of the Greeks like Plato and especially Aristotle. And Maimonides believes that the God of Judaism, the one God of Judaism, is identical with the God of the philosophers, with the God of Aristotle, what Aristotle calls the prime mover or the first cause or the necessary being. And we'll see some of that language in this philosophical treatise. Maimonides believes that Judaism is actually identical with the God of the philosophers. And he believes as well that Judaism is identical with the rationally derived principles that have been discerned and passed down through the Western philosophical tradition. Now, I'm not an expert in Plato or Aristotle. I know a little bit. Some of you may know a little bit as well. But one of the things that these philosophers believed was that through the faculty of reason, we're able to learn and prove a lot of things about the world. By the way, our society, our Western society, is also in large part based on the ideas that were taught by these philosophers, ideas like natural rights, ideas like the primacy of reason, that through reason, through the scientific method, you're able to learn things about the world. By looking at the world, you can learn about it. By thinking hard enough about the world, you can understand things about it. And so Maimonides believes that Judaism, the Judaism revealed by the Torah, and he does believe that the Torah was revealed by God and handed down to Moses, he believes that that is identical with the rationally derived principles of these philosophers. And so he sets out in his book to prove that they're the same thing, to show that the Torah is actually teaching these rational principles that he and many other people in his time believed. There were other people in other religious traditions doing the same thing at the same time. In Christianity, they're often called the scholastics. Many of the scholastics actually were influenced by Maimonides. He's an influential thinker in this area of thought. And there's also a healthy tradition of this in Islam, which is known as kalam. The practitioners of it were known as the mutakallimun, or that is to say, the people who engage in rational speculation. Maimonides is critical of some of the mutakallimun, but he accepts the thinking of others of them. So the Guide for the Perplexed is Maimonides' attempt to, number one, explain what he believes is the philosophy of Judaism, and number two, to reconcile what the Torah seems to say with this rational Western philosophical tradition. Maimonides believes that the Torah really is the rational philosophical doctrine. And that when it seems to say something different, like, for example, when the Torah seems to say that God has hands, or when the Torah seems to say that people were created to look like God, in the image of God, or when the Torah seems to say that God came down from on high. These things that don't sound consistent with the idea of God as a rational, as a rational entity in the world. Maimonides believes that that's because you're reading the Torah wrong. That's not really what the Torah says, and he's going to explain to us in his book why the Torah really says these much more rational things. And that's why the first half of the Mishnah of the Guide of the Perplexed is actually a set of definitions. All we're going to read today will be definitions, and the definitions even themselves are fascinating, as Maimonides goes through and teaches us how to read the Torah as Jews. So those are the first two things he's trying to do. Number one, explain the philosophy of Judaism. Number two, reconcile the Torah with philosophy, with philosophical work. And number three, he's writing a treatise for us on how to live a proper life, on how Jews are meant to live, not in the sense of how do you make Kiddush and how far are you allowed to walk on Shabbat, but rather in the sense of how do you come into contact with the divine? How do you come into contact with God? Unlike a mystic who believes that you may come into contact with God through music or through meditation, Maimonides believes that you come into contact with God through intellectual pursuit. And we're going to see from the very beginning, he's very open about this idea that the highest forms of worship are intellectual forms of worship, through learning, through what he calls speculation. This is the proper and most important form of religious practice. And all of this is in the context of his philosophical beliefs, which he believes are what the Torah is really teaching. So that's my introduction to Maimonides and to the text that we're about to read. And so let me just pause here to ask, are there any questions? If you have a question, go ahead and you can raise your hand, and I'm happy to try to answer them. All right. Either I've put everybody to sleep or I answered it all so far. So the best place to start, what does Julie Andrews say in The Sound of Living? Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. Well, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to start reading the Guide of the Perplexed at the end. This is the fourth to last chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed. And, and in some ways it's a conclusion. This is what's known as the Parable of the Palace. How many of you read the text before you came here? Great. So, okay, some did not. That's fine. You didn't have to. But you might. But they're so dense that honestly, I wanted to give people a minute or a little opportunity to look at them first. Before we go on here, I see a couple of questions. Anita, go ahead. Oh, Anita, sorry, I just remuted you. You'll have to unmute again.
Yeah. No, sorry. I was raising my hand when you were asking who had read it.
Okay, great. All right. So, like I said, well, Anita, since you're unmuted, will you read for us?
Oh.
We're going to start here at the beginning. Well, like I said, we're going to start at the end with a simile or an allegory that Maimonides is painting for what is let's call it the good life. By the way, he gets this from Aristotle. One of the things that Aristotle believes is that we are all capable of living our best life. And Aristotle believes that your best life, for you might be something different than it is for me. Maimonides is a bit of an elitist, and he believes that your best life, well, we'll see what he believes that the best possible life is. Anita, if you'll read for us, please.
Sure. I will begin the subject of this chapter with a simile. A king is in his palace, and all his subjects are partly in the country and partly abroad. Of the former, some have their backs turned towards the king's palace, and their faces in another direction. And some are desirous and zealous to go to the palace, seeking to inquire in his temple and to minister before him, but have not yet seen even the face of the wall of the house. Of those that desire to go to the palace, some reach it and go round about in search of the entrance gate. Others have passed through the gate and walk about in the antechamber, and others have succeeded in entering into the inner part of the palace and being in the same room with the king in the royal palace. But even the latter do not immediately, on entering the palace, see the king or speak to him, Therefore, after having entered the inner part of the palace, another effort is required before they can stand before the king at a distance or close by, hear his words, or speak to him.
All right, Anita, thank you for reading. Alex, you have your hand up. You have a question?
Yes, but it's not pertinent to the text, so I can hold.
Okay, all right. So what Anita just read for us is an allegory. Maimonides calls it a simile. When you look at this text, you can kind of maybe even picture what he's drawing here: a palace, the king in the palace in the middle of the city, and people are in all different places. Now, you might see where he's going here, right? It's relatively transparent. The king is God. So Maimonides is now going to explain his parable for us. He's speaking in parables. And by the way, he believes that the Torah largely speaks in parables as well. And so he's in some ways using the language of the Torah, or speaking the way that the Torah would speak to us. So who are all these people? If you had to guess, or some of you have already read it, but if you had to guess, who are the people? Who are the ones inside the city versus outside the city, closer to the king versus farther from the king? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Anyone? Well, let's see what Maimonides says.
Jewish people.
Oh, sorry, I heard somebody say Jewish people. Was that you, Sai?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Sai says Jewish people. The Jewish people, Sai, you're saying are the ones inside or outside or closer or farther?
Well, it's a variety of people with different aspects or different loyalty or commitment to God.
Okay, great. Peter and Joy, you have a thought?
When I first read this, without reading his explanation, my thought was that these were people that were clearly searching for something, but didn't seem to be so sure on what they were searching for or where or what they were going to find when they got there.
Mm-hmm. Right. So some of them are clearly searching for something, right? Some of them might be less searching. In fact, one of the things we have to look at is what direction they're facing. If you look, he says some of them have their backs turned. Those seem to be the ones that are not searching, right? Whereas some of them are desirous, here it is, they want to get into the palace. So we have here, we're already starting to figure out this metaphor a little bit. Some of these people are searching and some are not searching. Some of them are searching and know how to get in. And some of them are searching, walking around. Let's see if he describes walking around here, going around about in search of the entrance gate, but they don't know how to get in, right? So there's a desire here, a wanting to get in, and then there's a knowing how to get in as well to the palace, to see God. Ira, go ahead.
Well, the whole concept of those turning their backs, Maimonides as a philosopher is trying to show how we relate to God. We know that when one turns their back, they may not really be searching to get in, but are either denying, walking away from, and that's been historically even what we do today. Some people will not turn their backs when they walk away from the kotel, right? Because after all, you got to face the wall. Some will not turn their back on the open ark, but they back up from the ark and then turn. So I think Maimonides using the turning of the back from the king and the palace is quite evident to behaviors of today as well.
Interesting. Yeah, so what then is the metaphor of turning your back on the palace? It has something to do with, as Maimonides puts it, not even searching for God. And he does use the language of searching for God. Now, some people here want to search for God, but they don't know how. And some have figured out how, and are moving slowly forward into the city, into the inner chamber, maybe even in the same in the same chamber with God. So he says, I will now explain my simile. We won't read this whole thing. There's so much text here. The people who are abroad, the ones who are not even in the city, he says, are the ones that he describes as having no tradition, essentially. Those who, these are people who are not part of the Western religious world as far as he's concerned. He describes them essentially as Turks and people from the far north, and people from the far south. Maimonides is a little bit racist, I'm sorry to say, because he was definitely looking at people, in sub-Saharan Africa and those far north, of the Muslim world, as essentially having no tradition whatsoever. He wasn't right about that, of course. They had their own traditions, but they aren't part of this this religious tradition that we Jews and Muslims and Christians are part of. Yeah, Ed, did you have a question before I go on?
Yes, Rabbi, I'm probably going a little ahead because I did read this part before, but just picking on what you just said, he talked about that some people you have to kill them, slay them. Is that part of some kind of simile or something, or is he literally meaning you should kill people who don't?
So there he means it here. That's the next paragraph. There he means we're talking about these people that have turned their backs on God. So first we have the ones that are not even in the city. Those are the ones that have no tradition as far as he's concerned. Then you have those that have turned their backs on the palace. Those who are the ones who he says possess religion and belief and thought, but happen to hold false doctrines. They're the ones who have gotten religion wrong. He might be thinking about Christians here, to be honest with you. He doesn't exactly say that, but he might be thinking about Christians who he would have believed, living in the Muslim world, he might have believed that they had some idolatrous practices. So that may be what he's talking about here. Then there are those who desire to arrive at the palace, but have never seen it. Look at this. This is interesting. Who are they? They want to get into the palace, but they've never seen it. They are the mass of religious people. Religious Jewish people is who he's talking about. So we might think that the ultimate in piety is following the law, keeping Shabbat, keeping kosher, doing all the things that Judaism teaches you to do. We might think that that's the picture of piety. Not for Maimonides. For Maimonides, that mass of people who basically just keep the laws, they keep Judaism, they're the ones who, they want to get in the palace, but they've never seen the palace. The palace is not found in keeping kosher or keeping Shabbat or keeping the basic laws of Judaism. That's fine, that's good, he's not against that, but that's not where the palace is found, he says. Those are the multitude who observe the divine commandments but are ignorant. Those who arrive at the palace but go around it are the ones who study the law. They study Jewish law. They don't just follow it. They try to learn about it. They study Talmud. They talk about the laws. They talk about what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it, and they delve into the meaning of the law. So they're like scratching at the gates, right? They're trying to get in there, but they can't. But they can't quite get there. They're walking around the palace. They believe in the true principles of faith, he says, and learn the practical worship of God, but they are not trained, and here we get to the crux of the issue, in the philosophical treatment of the principles of the law. To get in, what do you have to do? You have to study philosophy. You have to think about the why, not just the what. You have to think about the nature of God and the nature of the world. That, for Maimonides, is the ticket into the palace. Those who undertake to investigate the principles of religion, they've come into the antechamber. The principles of a religion being the why. Why do we do certain things? You're in the foyer now, folks. You've taken your first steps into the chamber. Those who have succeeded in finding a proof for everything that can be proved, and Maimonides believes that he can prove the existence of God. He's not the only one who believes that in this time period, but those who have actually found these proofs, he says, they're the ones who are entering the inner gate. Ultimately, to be inside the room with God means to study philosophy, to study metaphysics, to delve into these questions of what is God really like? What is the world really like? Study, 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 study. That, for Maimonides, is how you approach God. So Maimonides never says that you shouldn't study Jewish law, never says that you shouldn't follow Jewish law. In fact, he believed that people did need to follow Jewish law. And in the Minute Torah, he teaches them how to follow Jewish law. But for Maimonides, interestingly, in many ways for Reform Judaism, the pursuit of God is actually much less about what you do and much more about what you think about and what you study and how you delve into these important questions about the why we do what we do. So I'm going to skip this next paragraph, even though it's fascinating, where he goes into different kinds of prophets. We'll get to prophecy later. He essentially says that some of those in the inner chamber, the light is very bright, and some of them only get flashes. And that means exactly what you think it does, right? Flashes of wisdom, flashes of content, of knowledge. And there was only one person who the light was on all the time, and that was Moses. Not him, Moses, but the original Moses is the prophet for whom the light was on all the time. And as we're going to see when we get to the end of our session of our texts, Maimonides believes that to be a prophet is not just to be some guy who predicts the future. Maimonides believes that to be a prophet is to be a great intellectual and to have a vision of the world as better than or different than it is. So I see a few hands, and then we'll go on with our text. Carla, Alex, Norm. Go ahead, Carla.
I'm assuming that Maimonides is well versed in Talmud, and given the portion of Talmud that we studied last week, where Breurius says or 2 weeks ago, pray for the sin to stop, not the sinner, I found it really disturbing to say it may become necessary to slay them.
Yeah, I understand your point. He lived a long time ago, and he lived in a different world than we did. Maimonides is not a modern person, and his sensibilities are different than ours. So just like when we read the Torah and we say we may or may not agree with that, there are going to be things in here that we don't agree with as well. I cut out some of the most racist parts, to be honest with you, of this chapter. And he also does say, as you point out, Carla, he says that it may be necessary to kill some of these infidels. We don't have to agree with that part. In fact, I'm pretty sure we don't agree with that part. It is deeply problematic, and I think we just need to name that. And
just that it goes directly against Breuria's words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand your point. Alex?
Yeah, this might be a little bit repetitive, but while Anita was reading the paragraphs, the impression that I had about what he was talking about was knowledge, not religion. And now, knowing Maimonides and his inclination for Greek philosophy, that might be the same thing, right? Because the pursuit of knowledge is the ultimate goal of the philosopher, right? And the sophos, the knowledge is what they love. And you can probably replace all those words, all the examples that are given in the subsequent paragraphs with the pursuit of knowledge, and I think that they will make sense. And then probably he says that later, right? That the only way to reach full understanding or full closeness to God is through understanding of the world that surrounds you and studying. And in order to understand it, you need to study it. So it's very it's very Greek, this type of stuff.
It is. It's very Greek, but it's also very Jewish in the sense that, Judaism does place study at the center. And Maimonides never says and never believes that you don't need to also do the practices. And that's where he, as a rationalist, departs from Reform Judaism as rational Judaism. He never believes that you don't have to also perform the practices, but he does believe, and we'll see this again later on in our texts, not today, but probably 2 weeks from now. He does believe that the practices of Judaism are meant to lead you to a higher understanding. Maimonides believes that every Jewish practice there is has a reason, and mostly those reasons are something like making your body healthy so that you can study, making society stable so that you can learn, For Maimonides, the pursuit of knowledge is the highest form, and we're going to see that actually in the next paragraph, that the pursuit of knowledge is the highest form of worship, and everything Jews do is meant to lead them toward a greater pursuit of knowledge. Norm, go ahead. You have a hand up as well.
Yes, thanks. A brief comment and then a question about two of the parts. The first comment dovetails on the previous comment about the issue of tolerance, and which struck me very quickly as well, because in the Jewish world, we're really struggling with tolerance. If you think about the discourse that's presently going on in the state of Israel, within the Jewish community, let alone between the Jewish community and the Arab community, let alone in American community presently, and tolerance for discourse. So, it's struck me in the time that we live in, how difficult it is to digest, that particular formulation of the Rambam. More to the question. So, I was interested in the bar that's set for getting into the inner circle with God. And it's a question, where is the place of piety versus deep study? Is deep study a pathway to piety? Can piety stand alone without deep study? How are they related? Because I often think of people who I've known who I think engage in deep study, but I'm not sure they're very pious, and other people who haven't and are very pious.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one question. The other question relates to section 4, which is, he's so interested in the study of natural science. Is natural science a pathway towards the study of metaphysics, or they can be independent of each other in his mind?
Okay, great question. So on your first question, remember, when we study Maimonides, we're studying one person with one particular set of views.
Yes.
And with regard to piety, if the Rambam were here, I think the Rambam would say something along the lines of that our pious actions are meant to lead us to a greater sense of communion with God through knowledge. Remember that the Rambam believes, and maybe even in a semi-mystical way, mystical for an intellectual, he believes that through study, through deep study and through intellectual pursuit, you actually get close to God. So in that way, he's actually trying to do the same thing as the Baal Shem Tov is doing, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, which is to get you closer to God, to get you into touch with God. But Maimonides teaches that you do it through deep study, and that your Jewish actions, you're keeping kosher, you're keeping Shabbat, your even your ethical actions, like having honest weights and measures in business. These things are meant to provide a scenario where you can come closer to God through study. That's what this parable essentially says. Now, we can agree or disagree, right? But his parable essentially says the way you get close to God is through study. That may, more than anything else, be a reflection of Maimonides, because that seems to be the kind of person he was. He believed, as a rationalist, that study was the route to God. And he believed that through deep thinking and through philosophical speculation, you actually can learn things and know things about God that you didn't know before. Somebody else might come along, like the Baal Shem Tov might come along and say, if you sing I Diggy Die 1,000 times and are in community, you will come close to God. You will have a mystical experience. Maimonides believed that the route there was through intellectual study. I can't remember your second question anymore.
No, the second question was the role of study of natural science towards metaphysics.
Right. Okay. So this is a really important contribution that Maimonides makes to our Jewish world, and that is the belief that that truth is truth. Maimonides believed that science was a route to God, and he believed, and that's part of what we're going to see here in the Minute Torah. In the Guide of the Perplexed, he believed that anything we learn through science must also be corroborated with the Torah. And that if it's not, that means that we either misunderstand science or we misunderstand the Torah. He did not buy the idea that somehow the Torah teaches different things that are in science. And he believes that through the study of the body, the study of the natural world around him, we can learn things about the world and about God. And that if we read the Torah correctly, we will then see those things reflected in the Torah as well. The study of science is absolutely a route to metaphysics for him. And that, I would say, is also one of the bedrock principles of our Judaism, of Reform Judaism, that truth can be learned, that God can be accessed through science. That's different than those who would say God can only be accessed through revelation, through the giving of Torah. That's a great question. And in that, Maimonides is not unique anymore, but maybe one of the first to have said something like that. Ira, go ahead, and then I think we'll move on to our next text.
So if you look at this paragraph, and then the last line, excuse me, the true worship of God is only possible when correct notions of God have previously been conceived. So what we're really looking at here, if you look back to the middle of his paragraph, unless we have a notion, and unless we honestly believe that notion, our prayer will be, I don't know, void. Not void to the world, but coming out of us in a void way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not even necessarily void, but those are the people, to go back to his parable, those are the people that are wandering around the city, right? They're doing all the right actions, but they're not getting in. So Maimonides believes, and I'm curious what people think of this idea actually, Maimonides believes that the true worship has to do with striving to understand God, not only talking to God, but striving to understand God. And also Maimonides wishes to do away with what he sees as being erroneous understandings of God out there. For example, God has a face. God, physically created us. All these anthropomorphisms that are found in the Torah, and the Torah straight out says them, right? So we may look at the Torah and we say, oh, well, the Torah doesn't really mean that. That's an allegory. The reason that we say that is because we are students of Maimonides. Maimonides it's not that he was one of the first, but he was one of the most forceful to come out and say, the Torah doesn't really mean those things. And true worship of God means understanding what God really is, not worshiping an idol in the form of the Jewish God. One of the examples actually that Professor Siskin gives, he's the professor that's going to join us in a few weeks, is imagine if in the Greek tradition, there, instead of being 12 gods on Olympus, there was only one, just Athena. And Athena was, just as Athena is in the Greek tradition. She's she has human form, and she has people that she loves and people that she hates, and she kills and gets angry and does all these things. Would that be monotheism, as far as Maimonides is concerned, or as far as you're concerned? There's only one God. Is monotheism simply the belief that there's only one God? Well, Maimonides says no. Maimonides says that monotheism is actually the belief that God is incorporeal, that God is unique, that God is something outside of our capacity really to understand. The belief in one God exactly as it's described in the Torah, that's actually a form of idolatry as far as he's concerned. If you believe that God has a face, has a back, gets angry in the way that people get angry, has emotions in the way that people have emotions, you're not understanding God. That's really what he means when he says this. Now, again, we can agree or disagree, although largely as Reform Jews, as rationalists, we are in many ways the recipient of this tradition. Maimonides is one of the first to put this idea on the table, that Judaism is teaching us something different than what it literally says in the Torah. So, yes, Anita, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm curious, earlier on when he talks about the second group, not the ones who turn their backs, but the ones who believe in God, but have the wrong notion. Not not the ones who are ignorant. There's another one. The ones who he thinks should be slain. He says they're worse than the ones who don't believe in God.
Yeah, I think that was this group right here. Those
Okay.
they're the ones who have their backs turned.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And he says that they're basically misguided. They have false doctrines. So I guess I'm wondering, like later on, he talks about the four, definitions of four different words, and he's trying to clarify correct definitions from incorrect definitions.
Right.
And earlier on, he talks about, it seems like, the worst thing you can do is think that you believe in God, if you use this as the parable, but it's false. Who decides that it's false, and who decides when it's correct?
Oh, well, Maimonides does.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I say it facetiously, but not exactly facetiously, because he really, I mean, first of all, he thinks he's right. And as we're going to see, his view of God, for those who've studied Greek philosophy, his view of God sounds an awful lot, although not exactly, like Aristotle's, right? And so Maimonides is going to lay down a set of rules here. That's what this first part of the book is. It's a set of rules for how to read the Torah and for what he believes can be proven about the world and about God. And he's not the only one engaging in this kind of practice. So there's a long tradition in the Western world of philosophers who believed that certain things were true about the world and that they could discern those things through reason. But those philosophers, as you point out, Anita, don't always agree with each other. And so, for example, Aristotle was a student of Plato, and Plato and Aristotle had some very different views about metaphysics, so much so that when Plato died, Aristotle, one of his most prized students, was not chosen to lead the academy that Plato had taught at. And so Aristotle had to go out into the world and make his own way, right? Because they believed very different things. So what we're reading here really is Maimonides' view. And there were others who agreed and others who disagreed, and there were sharp critics of Maimonides as well. And we could sit here and criticize him as well, and we could say, well, we believe that there are other routes to God, like through mysticism, like through music, like through community. There may be other routes to God besides pure intellectual pursuit. This is simply his way. I will say Maimonides was a genius and thought very highly of his own opinion. Those are two very important things to know about him. So when you ask who says he's right, who gets to make these decisions, he wouldn't say I do. He would say these things are self-evident. These are things that we know by looking at the world. In the end, they're the things that he believes, and that's what is here before us. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
In completely discounting if there's such a word, the corporality of God, how would Maimonides explain the vengefulness of God as described in the Torah? And I'm thinking of a couple of incidents. One being Korach's band that gets eaten up by the earth.
That, you know what, Peter, that's a great question that I don't know the answer to right now, but I'm writing it down, and it's something that I'm going to look into, hopefully in time for next week, because he certainly must answer that question. But let's use that question as a segue, actually, into the next part of our text, which is to look at how Maimonides does read the Torah. So you can go back and you can read this stuff for yourself. Two really quick, interesting things. First of all, this passage is really interesting, where Maimonides tells us that what's one of the highest mitzvot is to love God, right? Ahavat Adonai. In the V'ahavta we say, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. Maimonides says that to love God is identical with to know God. So again, for him, as an intellectual, as a rationalist, as a philosopher, the way to love God is to get to know God. Now, actually, there's something to that, right? When you love somebody, you want to know them better. If you love your partner, but you don't know them very well, then do you really love your partner? Maimonides is asking maybe a question like that about God. If you say you love God and you follow all these laws, but you don't really engage in the act of getting to know what God really is, then are you really showing love for God? That's what he's saying. And that leads us into our next part. But first, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have a question I'm a little confused about.
Yeah.
Maimonides was living in a Muslim world mostly, and he was not only revered or respected by the Jews, but I would assume also by the Muslim community, right?
To some extent, I mean, largely by Jews, but Muslims were reading him for sure. He was writing in Arabic.
Okay, so is he not insulting everybody else who is not Jewish? Like he's saying that the only way to know God, the correct way, is our way, and that everybody else is mistaken. So he's basically telling the rest of his world that they're all on the wrong path.
Yes, but it seems possible that the Muslims were doing the same thing, right? The Muslim mutakalimun, the philosophers were doing the same thing, and the Christians were doing the same thing as well. And Maimonides, in many ways, his book is an apologetic for Judaism, where he's trying to show that Judaism is the highest form of religion, because Judaism is identical with these philosophical traditions. He's not the only one to have done that. Yehuda Halevi, writing in Spain, also writes a book called the Kuzari, where he essentially goes through the formulations or the arguments for each religion and shows why Judaism is the best of the religions. So this is this is a thing that people were doing during that time period. And one of the things he's trying to do is to show that Judaism has the closest conception to these things that we philosophers, we smart people know are true, essentially.
But there's a difference between saying that there's all different religions and all different paths to knowing God, but that ours is the best, as opposed to saying ours is correct and everybody else is false.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me he's in the second category.
Yeah, I don't know if I know the answer to that question. To be honest with you, I don't think he's in the second category, because he's reading the writings of Muslim philosophers and agreeing or disagreeing with them. So I suspect that Maimonides believed that you could reach God, the real God, the way that he conceived of God, through either tradition. And in many ways, Judaism and Islam are very close to each other. They're both very strict monotheistic religions, leaving Christianity out of it for a moment. They're both of them believe in the uniqueness and the unity of God in very important ways. And so I suspect that Maimonides would have believed that you could get there that way as well, but that Judaism maybe even had a higher conception or a higher version of it. But I don't think he's saying that Islam has no path to God. I think he is saying that Judaism has the better path to God. Although we should make a list of questions to ask Professor Siskin when he shows up in a few weeks, because these may be things that he can help us to discern.
Because when I read the text before the class, I read it the total opposite way of you. I didn't read it that he was saying that we have the best way to get to God. I read it as him saying we have the correct way, and everybody else is totally misguided and misled.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I know about him is that he read and respected many Muslim scholars. So it's hard to reconcile that with the idea that Maimonides really was living in this greater Islamic society, and in many ways the Fatimid Caliphate, in a relatively tolerant Islamic society where there was a lot of cross-pollination between religions. And so I think, without going back and reading it and trying to find, what he's really saying, I suspect that he believes that Judaism is better, but that that there's goodness to some of what the other religions, and particularly Islam, would have had to say. But it's a good question, and I'd like to look into it farther. So he talks about knowledge of God. Knowledge of God is love of God. And then he also tells us, and this is important, the object of this treatise is to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law, who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duties, and at the same time has been successful in his philosophical studies. Human reason has attracted him to abide within its sphere, and he finds it difficult to accept as correct the teaching based on the literal interpretation of the law, and especially that which he himself or others derive from those homonymous. Homonymous means a word that has more than one meaning. Homonymous metaphorical or hybrid expressions. Here we go. Hence, he is lost in perplexity and anxiety. Remember, what is the name of this book? The Guide for the Perplexed. Who are the perplexed? The perplexed that Maimonides is writing for are people who are religious Jews who believe in the divine nature of the Torah, that the Torah represents God's will for human beings, but who also have studied philosophy and who believe in the incorporeal nature, the uniqueness of God in ways that we're going to see, and don't know how to read the two to say the same thing. So they are lost in perplexity. The Guide for the Perplexed is Maimonides' way of showing how the two are really saying the same thing. And one of the ways that he does that is to redefine words for us. So starting here, this is very close to the very beginning of the Torah, it says, let us make human beings in our image, right here, after our likeness. And God created humanity in God's image. Sorry for all the masculine language here. It would have taken a lot to go through and change all the he's and his's to something else. God created humanity in God's image, or tselem. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, God created them. When we look at this sentence, not for a second do we think that it means God created us to look like God. Do we think that it means that God has 2 hands and 2 legs and a nose? Right? How could it mean that? But one of the reasons that we think that, again, is because we live after Maimonides. And it turns out that there have been lots of people through history who maybe did believe that God that God has a form of some kind. And so Maimonides is the first argument that he's going to make here. The first definition he's going to give us is, what does it mean to be in God's image? Peter and Joy, go ahead.
The problem that I see with this is that, notwithstanding all of what he's saying about incorporality, I'm not even sure if that's a word, is that the words used in Torah are he created him, male and female, he created them. So if he created them, then he is a person, quote unquote, or has a personification. So just from the very words, I mean, he's not going to redefine he's going to redefine tselem. And you know, and the very, I mean, Hebrew is a language that has masculine and feminine. It doesn't have a neuter.
Yeah, it is a problem through and through, right? Maimonides is going to go through and he's going to redefine a bunch of words for us. But then, Peter, because you can't have been the first person to bring this up to him, he's going to give us a catch-all. I'll jump forward to our catch-all, then I'll come back here. Our catch-all, this is on page 8, for those who have the text in front of you. He quotes the Talmud. He says, you no doubt know the Talmudical saying, which includes in itself the various kinds of interpretation connected with our subject. It runs this. This is from the Talmud. The Torah speaks according to the language of man. That is to say, expressions which can be easily comprehended and understood by all are applied to the Creator. So Maimonides ultimately, his ultimate explanation of the Torah's language is that the Torah had to say it somehow, and we're human beings. So therefore, the Torah speaks in our language. The Torah speaks in language that we can understand. When it defines God as a he, well, that's because Hebrew language doesn't have another way to say it. When it says that God has a face, that's because maybe we needed, we needed some kind of physical language to be able to understand. Even those words that are allegory, Maimonides will ultimately tell us, are imperfect for describing God, because God is so other, so unique, so different, so outside of what we understand, that words can't even begin to describe God. That's your spoiler alert for next week. Next week's spoiler alert is words cannot even begin to describe God. Therefore, all words are by definition imperfect. So Maimonides is going to go through and he's going to redefine a bunch of words for us so that we can see that the Torah actually speaks in the language of philosophy. But at the same time, he's telling us that even those words are imperfect. Even those words can't really describe what God is. So let's look at the words that Maimonides defines for us, and just know, Peter, next week that he's going to tell us all the reasons that even the words he's defined don't really describe what God is. So here, Peter, since you were just talking, do you want to read a little bit here? This first paragraph, which we won't read because we don't have a lot of time, is going to tell us that Maimonides believes that some people out there have been of the opinion that God actually has an image. Those, he believes, are not the brightest people out there. And so, and ironically, one of those might be Rashi. Rashi, who when God says, I will put my hand upon Egypt, Rashi says an actual hand. Maimonides is not convinced that these people are, understand God at all. Therefore, he's going to show us that the Torah never meant that Tselem meant a physical image in any way. Peter, will you read right here where it says the incorporeality?
The incorporeality of the divine being and his unity in the true sense of the word, for there is no real unity without incorporeality, will be fully proved in the course of the present treatise. Part 2.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
In this chapter, it is our sole intention to explain the meaning of the word selim and demute.
Yep, so tselem is the word we use to mean image, and demut means likeness. So it says that God created people in the tselem and demut, the image and likeness of God.
I hold that the Hebrew equivalent of form in the ordinary acceptation of the word, the figure and shape of things, is tahor.
Toar.
Thus we find, and Joseph was beautiful in tohar, form. It is also applied to form produced by human labor, as he marketh his form, toar, with the line. He marketh its form, toar, with compass. The term is not at all applicable to God.
So what Maimonides, he does this a lot, where he goes through a bunch of verses and quotes them. I've tried to cut out a lot of the examples he gives because they're quite tedious. And what he's saying is, you might have thought that Tselem, image of God, meant a form, a physical likeness of God, but no, it doesn't. There's another word for that. The word for that is toar. And look at toar, it actually means Joseph's physical form, or it actually means the form of the labor or whatever. This term is not at all applicable to God. On the other hand, the word tselem, image, which is applied to God, means something else. So Peter, if you'll go on.
The term tselem, on the other hand, signifies the specific form, that which constitutes the essence of a thing, whereby the thing is what it is. The reality of a thing insofar as it is a particular thing. In man, the form is that constituent which gives him human perception, and on account of this intellectual perception, the term tselem is employed in the sentences. Wow. In the tselem of God, created he him.
All right, I'll stop you there.
Thank you.
How many people got lost in the course of the last two sentences that Peter read? What he's saying here is, it turns out that for Maimonides, and this is what he believed the Torah actually means. The word tselem doesn't mean a physical form at all. Here, I'll highlight the part we just read. The word tselem doesn't mean a physical form at all. What it actually means is that which constitutes the essence of the thing, whereby the thing is what it is. In other words, what makes a human, that's its tselem. What makes God, God, that's its tselem. What makes a tree, that is the treeness, right? The personness, the grassness, that is the tselem of the thing. Maimonides will argue later that the tselem, the essence of humanity, is essentially being a living, rational being. That is the essence of human being, is that we are living and we are rational. And he believes that there's no other thing in the world that is living and rational the way we are. There are things that are rational, like God or angels maybe. There are things that are living, like other animals. But living plus rational equals the tselem of us. And so that when the Torah says that we were created in the tselem of God, it means that we have parts of the same essence of God. The thing that makes God God is also part of the thing that makes us us. Now, that actually sounds a lot like the way we describe what it means to be created in the image of God. We talk about the image of God being the ability to choose right from wrong, being morality, being the capacity for rational thought, being the capacity to learn and grow. These are the things we understand to be the image of God in some ways. Maimonides is giving us that idea here. We're really looking at the original conception of that idea, where Maimonides essentially tells us the image of God really means to contain the essence of God. And I want to go on. We only have 8 minutes left, so I want to go on to the next one. Maybe one of the most problematic stories in the Torah in terms of anthropomorphism of God is the story of what happens right after the golden calf. Right after the golden calf, Moses cries out to God, God, let me, help me out here, essentially, Moses says. Let me behold your presence. Let me know that you are with me. Let me see your face. And God says, many of you know this story, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. And then God says, but you can see my back if you want to. Now, we might have been okay if God just said, let me, you can see me, you can't see my face. But God has a back. I mean, the Torah literally says God has a back. Why does the Torah have to say that? And then it says that God passed by Moses and proclaimed this very famous passage that many of us know how to chant in Hebrew, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet, right? God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, etc. Beautiful story, great story. We read it twice a year on the holidays. We chant parts of it on the high holy days. It says that God has a face and a back, and it says that God passed by. What does that mean to say that God passes by? To say that God passes by is actually a form of weakness. Because if God is all-powerful, then God doesn't need to pass anywhere. God is already there. The reason that I have to walk from here to the living room is because I'm not currently in the living room. And my not being in the living room is a form of weakness. I can't be in both places at once. That's different from God as far as Maimonides is concerned. So why on earth would it say that God passed before Moses when God doesn't need to pass anywhere? And so he goes on to explain these 3 terms, panim, face, achor, back, and avar, which means to pass by. And these 3 terms together really in many ways give us what Maimonides believes about God. And this will be a really good segue into next week for us. So remember, he's defining terms. The first thing he tells us is that the term panim is, however you say that, homonymous, which means it has more than one definition. One of the definitions, he says, is a face, literal face. This is my panim. In Yiddish, we say punim, right? My grandma used to pinch my cheeks and call me a shena punim, because punim means a face, while panim means a literal face. Panim also, part 2 that I cut out of here, apparently can mean anger. And Maimonides gives quotes from the Torah to prove that panim means anger. And finally, he says, another meaning of the word is the presence and existence of the person. And again, he quotes passages here that show that. From the book of Genesis, he died in the presence, in the lifetime of his brethren. Well, it doesn't mean that someone died in the face of his brethren. It means in the presence of, in the lifetime before. So Maimonides is showing that the word panim, not only allegorically, but literally, the word panim means in the presence of, in the existence of, not only in the face of. And he says here the expression, in the same sense, the word panim must be understood in, and my face, panai, must not be seen, God's face. That is to say, my true existence cannot be comprehended. When God says you cannot see my face, Maimonides says, that means you cannot comprehend God's true essence, God's true existence. What about God's back? When God says Moses can see his back, what does that mean for Maimonides? Well, the Hebrew term achor is a noun signifying a back. Here's a back, something behind me is achor. The spear came out behind him. But it also means, in part 2, the term includes also the idea of following a thing or conforming with the moral principles of some other being. Compare, you shall walk achrei, after the Lord your God. And that's the same word, achor, back. So when you walk behind God, Maimonides says, that doesn't mean you're literally walking behind God. It means you're following God's ways. So therefore, God's back has something to do with with God's ways. Or they shall walk after the Lord, i.e. follow God's will. In this sense, the word occurs in Exodus. You shall see my back. That is to say, you shall perceive that which follows me, is similar to me, and is the result of my will. All things created by me, as will be explained in the course of this treatise. So when it says you cannot know my face, Maimonides says it means you cannot know God's essence. But when it says you can see my back, it means you can see and know me through the things that exist by virtue of my will. These things exist because of me. Therefore, you can know me through these things. One more definition, and then we'll close. The word avar, to pass by, is used figuratively to denote to abandon one aim and turn to a different aim and object. As if to, for example, he shot an arrow causing him to miss the aim, laha aviro. So Maimonides says that the word avar means not only to pass by, but also to switch from one aim to another. And so this is the meaning of, and you shall see my back. Accordingly, it is stated, hold on, what did I want to read here? Accordingly, it is stated in the above mentioned passage that God withheld from Moses that perception which is termed the seeing of the divine face. Remember, that means knowing God's true essence. Seeing of the divine face. Hold on, I lost my place. And substituted for it another gift. That is the knowledge of the acts attributed to God, which, as I shall explain later, are considered to be different and separate attributes of the Supreme. In asserting that God withheld from Moses the higher knowledge, I mean to say that this knowledge was unattainable, that by its nature, it was inaccessible to Moses. For man, whilst able to gain perfection by applying his reasoning faculties to the attainment of what is within the reach of his intellect, either weakens his reason or loses it altogether as soon as he ventures to seek a higher degree of knowledge, as I shall elucidate later, etc., unless he be granted special aid from heaven. In other words, I know this is technical and kind of confusing, but in other words, avar, to pass by, doesn't mean God physically passed by Moses. What it means is that God took one aim. Moses asked to know God's essence, to see God's face, and God replaced it with the knowledge of God's back. And that is what is available to human beings. Here on earth, what can we do? What can we know about God? Can we experience God's true essence, Maimonides says? No. We can come into contact with the things that exist because of God. We can meet God through people. We can meet God through relationships. We can meet God through the created world, through nature, through the things around us. We can meet God through ritual. We can meet God through study. We can meet God through philosophy. These are the ways that we can come into contact with God. This is what it means to know to see God's back. But what we can't ever do is to really fully comprehend the essence, to see God's face. So when we meet again in 2 weeks, we'll take up the question of what does Maimonides believe that you can and can't know, and that you can and can't say about God. Because ultimately he believes that we can come into contact with God, but that we're limited in what we can know and what we can say about God. But that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to try, essentially. So Ed, I see you have a question, and with that we'll end. Go ahead, Ed.
It's not really a question, Rabbi. I just wanted to thank you. On behalf of the board of directors of Kol Ami, I wanted to thank you and the Adult Education Committee for starting this really fascinating series. And I think the number of participants is indication that this is going to be a very popular series moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ed. I appreciate it. And for being here, both as a member and as a representative of the board. Thank you for that. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I know I threw a lot at you tonight, and there's more to come, but I hope this was interesting. I'd love to have your feedback. If you want to shoot me an email with any feedback about the course, was it understandable? Was it too much? Was it too fast, too slow, etc.? Let me know, because as I said, I'm just figuring this out as we go along. And don't worry, 2 weeks from now, we'll have answered all the questions. We will fully understand God and the nature of the universe around us. I see that Carla asked which pages we should read for next time. Next time, we will be reading the section that's called What Can We and Can't We Know About God? So that is essentially pages 9 through 14. That probably is going to take us an hour and a half in and of itself. If it doesn't, we'll go a little farther. But that's the part that I expect to talk about for next time. And a little homework assignment for next time. Think about what words you would use to describe God. If you were asked to describe God, what would you say? And with that, I'll end. And thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Rabbi Micah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.
Hi there.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Thank
Every
you.
day. Good night.
Micah, do you want this all processed through Temple? We're talking about emails. Do you think that they should make a flyer and send it to Temple as far as the book club stuff?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Okay, so I'll talk to her about that.
Okay.
Night all.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I sent you a question through the personal chat. If you have some time to take a look at it, it would be great to hear your thoughts on it.
Okay. I'll have to research that. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm happy to try to look into it.
Neither do I, but it struck me like it might be related because what I heard in Argentina as the part of the Christian world I grew up is very, very close to the way Maimonides expresses it. So
interesting. Yeah. Well, and we can ask Dr. Siskin that question also at the end of the series.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was
Great.
excellent.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Mike, I recorded it starting about 10 minutes after it. Peter reminded me that we should be recording it. So.
Oh, I'm glad you remembered. I thought about it and then I forgot. So
yeah, me too.
We can put it on the website, or yeah, we can. If you send me or Marla access to how to get access to it, and we'll figure out what to do.
So yeah, I'm not even sure how to do that. Like it asked me if I wanted to record it to my computer or to the cloud, and I chose the cloud, assuming that would be accessible to whoever's account this is.
Yeah, so that means Marla can get to it. So,
Yeah.
all right, I'll ask her if she can pull it down, and we should be able to put it on our website. I think we can't keep it in Zoom because it's too big, but we should be
Yeah.
able to put it in the website, or at least put it in our Google Drive and make it available. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I know there were a couple of people who mentioned that they weren't going to be able to come, but who wanted to watch. So,
Okay, great. Yeah, next time we'll try to remember to do it at the beginning. I forgot tonight.
yeah, me too.
Okay.
Great. I think it went really well. Very interesting. It's really
Hey,
good.
Shayla, it's nice to see you. How are
Hi,
you?
Shayla.
Good, thanks. Hi, Karen. Nice to see you.
You too. You too.
I
How are
haven't
you
seen you in
keeping?
ages.
I know. I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
How have you
I'm
been?
Shayla. Very well, thank you. I'm actually working on the Kol Ami cookbook, and actually this afternoon I was working on your recipe for what was it? Cabbage borscht, I think.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, I'm going to end the stream. It's good to see all of you.
Okay. Thanks
See you later.
again. Good night.
Good night.